Scott, you're muted.
Thanks. Every time I do that, we use a lot of meetings at work and everybody's like, Scott, you're talking away. All right, we'll try that again. Thanks for starting the recording, Kendra, and thank you everybody for joining us today. On behalf of the National Child Passenger Safety Board, thank you for joining us for a CEU webinar, Child Passenger Safety on Airplanes. Today's speakers are Aviation Safety Inspector, Cabin Safety and former flight attendant Catherine Burnett, and Chief Scientist and Technical Advisor for Crash Dynamics, Joseph Pellettiere. I knew I'd mess that up, Joseph, sorry. I'm Scott Downing. I'm the Fire EMS representative and the chair for the National Child Passenger Safety Board. We've planned a time at the end to answer questions. So please, as we go through the presentation, if you do have a question, type that into the Q&A box and we'll watch for those.
Scott, you're muted again.
I think it's Zoom and I don't get along because I didn't touch anything. And there we go, back to that. All right, so as a reminder, attendees are requested to not participate in this webinar if you're operating a motor vehicle. The webinar will be recorded and you can listen to the recording when you safely arrive at your destination. The recording, after the presentation, the recording will be posted to carseateducation.org within 1 to 2 business days. And for the child passenger safety technicians and attendants, the presentation qualifies for 1 CEU. Attendance on this webinar is required for at least 45 minutes for the CEU credit. And proof of attendance will be emailed 24 hours after the webinar. When entering the CEU into your Safe Kids profile, this is a webinar/teleconference, and all required information will be found on the proof of attendance. Please join me in welcoming Catherine and Joseph.
Joseph, you're muted. Joseph, you're muted.
See, I followed Scott's lead there. So I was like, thank you, Scott. As I mentioned, I'm Joseph Pellettiere, the Chief Scientist for Crash Dynamics at the FAA. My background and expertise is in crash worthiness, structures. I deal with occupant safety for cabin interiors for all occupants, from child passengers through adults through passengers with disabilities. And I'll turn it over here to Catherine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Burnett, as Scott and Joseph said. I'm a former flight attendant with 2 grown children, and I currently write rules and policy about cabin safety on commercial aircraft. I've always been such a staunch promoter of car seat use on aircraft, and for the last couple of years, I've worked with our aircraft certification and communication teams to provide information to caregivers and to safety professionals about ways to reduce injuries to children when they fly and to develop resources you can use to help increase the use of child seats on aircraft. I'm also a certified child passenger safety technician, like many of you.
And just a quick disclaimer, throughout this presentation, just because we are regulators, nothing we are saying is a comment on a regulation, official policy, we must follow official policies. Any mention of commercial products or services is not construed as an endorsement or recommendation. They're just used as examples that we use to demonstrate the concepts.
So I just want to clarify, Joseph, are you sharing your screen? I don't see it.
He is sharing it.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. And so as we go through, I just wanted to, I'm off camera so I can take a look at my notes. But again, I want to thank you for joining us, and thanks for the terrific work that you do to ensure children, who are our most vulnerable population, travel safety in vehicles. You've probably all read articles about turbulence on airplanes, or maybe you remember the recent Alaska Airlines event where the door plug blew out of the airplane, causing a rapid decompression through a gaping hole in the side of the airplane. Maybe you've wondered about the safety of children during such events. We know that forces are very different from vehicle accidents to those experienced on aircraft accidents. But we also know that car seats can save lives in both modes of transportation. Our goal today is to help you understand more about child passenger safety on airplanes and to provide you with information about the work the FAA is doing that you can share with parents and caregivers that will help them better understand their choices when taking their children on airplanes. We know there are many reasons why children should occupy an approved restraint device on an airplane. It's safe, it's comfortable, and it's convenient. Children incur injuries such as bruises, burns, and cuts during airplane travel, and using a car seat helps them keep them out of harm's way. Children are very used to their car seats, so they're very comfortable in them. And when a caregiver's arms aren't full of a squirming child, they can reach into bags or into overhead bins to get items for the child, and they can easily access their seat during boarding and deplaning or just to stretch during the flight. So it's very convenient for the caregiver. The Department of Transportation wants all caregivers to buckle up their children for the car ride to the airport, on the airplane, and when they leave the airport at their destination. I'd like to share with you one video that FAA produced to encourage the use of child restraints on airplanes. CPSTs call it a seat. But in aviation, we call it a child restraint system, or CRS. But just so we're all clear, the safest place for a child under the age of 2 is in their own airplane seat and secured in an approved child restraint system, or CRS. But we also recognize that price matters, and people will drive instead of fly to save money when they travel. We also know that driving is more dangerous than flying. So if we were to require seats for everybody on airplanes, data shows that 10 more children each year would die in a vehicular accident than in an airplane accident. And that's an unintended consequence of our requirement. That's why we need your help to inform parents and caregivers to voluntarily purchase a seat on an airplane for their children under 2, and to always correctly use an approved car seat that meets the child's height and weight. FAA regulations require anyone on board to occupy his own seat and to use the installed seatbelt. The previous slide noted that a child under 2 years of age can be held on an adult's lap. Many of us ask why, and really? So some history. When FAA issued the first regulations that required seatbelt use aboard aircraft around 1953, child safety restraints were not available. At the time, our study showed that an infant who could not hold his head upright or whose body had not matured enough to fit the contours of a seat could not properly use an adult seat and that safety restraint. Therefore, these young children were initially excluded from the 1953 safety restraint requirements for commercial aircraft. Further, because commercial air travel was fairly new, children rarely traveled on aircraft and were not a focus of either our safety regulations or legislation. However, as technology and research techniques have become more sophisticated, not only has child protection during flight become feasible, it's also become a necessity. Please note that regulations permit infants and children to occupy their own seat and to use an approved child restraint system. That's the best practice for airplane travel. So what are restraint systems and what are their purposes? They serve 2 purposes on aircraft: to prevent ejection of the occupant during a rapid deceleration or crash event, and they provide restraint during turbulence events. We know there's a definite hazard in air travel by infants and young children without proper restraint. Not only is an unrestrained child at an increased risk of injury or death to themselves, they are dangerous to other passengers. Unrestrained children, especially lap infants, are prone to injuries during flight. This is particularly true during hot meal service or turbulence. Children and lap-held infants seated in aisle seats are exposed to the risk of injury from fallen objects, aisle traffic, and burns from mishandled hot meals and beverages. The FAA defines a CRS as a hard-backed safety seat with internal restraints approved by the government for use in both motor vehicles and on aircraft. The device must have required labeling, which we'll show you on another slide. Many CRS approved for use in vehicles are not approved for use in aircraft because of the requirements for installation. So it's important for the parent or caregiver to read the user's manual and all warnings. So you're familiar with the two different testing criteria listed here. The FAA requires a device to meet NHTSA standards and the additional aviation requirements found in FMVSS 213 in order for that device to be certified for use in aircraft. But as we'll discuss in a bit, even though a device is approved for use in aircraft for several reasons, it might not be able to be secured appropriately in an airplane seat, or it might be difficult to do so. And we'll provide some tips and tricks to help caregivers. By regulation, anyone can use an approved CRS that accommodates their height and weight on any U.S. air carrier when that device is able to be secured in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions until they turn 18 years old. My team evaluates and grants requests from many adults with disabilities who need additional support when they travel in an airplane seat, mainly because they are over the age of 18. CRS must be secured in a forward-facing seat or berth. This means the airplane seat must face forward. It's not that it's unsafe to secure a CRS to a side or rear-facing airplane. It's just that FAA only tested CRS in forward-facing seats because those are the ones most air carriers have on their airplanes. We also require someone who is using a CRS to travel with a caregiver because it assigns responsibility to that caregiver to provide assistance during an emergency situation, such as releasing that user from the device in an evacuation. The CRS user must occupy the CRS not just during taxi, takeoff, and landing, which are the critical phases of flight, but also anytime the fasten seatbelt sign is illuminated. And finally, the device must be used in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions, just like when you're securing a car seat into a vehicle seat. This slide is showing that there are two separate required statements, but it's acceptable to combine them into one label as shown here. So when we talk about labels on aircraft, CRS, this is what we're talking about. U.S. flight attendants are required to ensure all CRS used on aircraft meet FAA requirements and will ask to see the approval label, including foreign labels with appropriate writing and designations. If a CRS does not have required labeling, you would not be allowed to use it and it would be checked plain side. Caregivers need to know where their car seat's label is and be ready to show it if asked. I'd like to talk about a few devices that are not approved for use in aircraft. You might be exposed to these as CPSTs. You know that there are two types of booster seats, high-backed and backless. The FAA defines a booster seat as any device that does not have an internal harness. Both high-back and backless boosters are used for positioning the child and not for restraint, and they must be used with a lap and a shoulder belt. Most commercial aircraft do not have restraint systems that include both a lap and a shoulder belt. And additionally, FAA testing showed that in a rapid deceleration or crash sequence, the booster provided no protection from the aircraft's seat back, crushing the child. There are several vest-type devices that are marketed as safer than traveling with your baby as a lap child, which is untrue. The vest materials do not meet flammability and strength test standards. In most tests, the buckles and materials failed. In other tests, the infant was positioned to act as an airbag for the adult, and the adult crushed the infant against the seat back in front of them. Further, the FAA does not permit an infant to occupy any type of vest that attaches to an aircraft's seatbelt during taxi, takeoff, and landing, or when the seatbelt sign is on. Similarly, belly belts or loop belts cause the infant to be crushed under the adult's weight as the adult moves forward in a rapid deceleration. In tests, the infants experienced abdominal injuries by the lap belt riding high on the soft tissue, And then the infant suffered head, face, and body injuries when it was smashed against the seat in front. Most of these harness type devices used in vehicles are not constructed of materials that meet or exceed FAA standards, and often their securement method cannot be duplicated on an airplane. For instance, specific to the Ride Safer device, the website states the current versions of the vest cannot be used on airplanes because we require a tether to be used with a lap-only seatbelt. Commercial airplanes are not fitted with floor or sidewall tether anchors. Commercial air carriers would have procedures for flight attendants during the performance of safety checks to ensure that non-approved devices were not in use during flight and when that seatbelt is required. Regulations allow the use of these devices during the cruise portion of a flight, which is when seatbelts are not required. But regulations also allow air carriers to prohibit the use of non-approved devices at all times, since policing their use puts flight attendants' safety in jeopardy. So for instance, think about a flight into Orlando where there are often many lap-held children. Air carriers found that flight attendants ended up in verbal dialogues with adults about removing the often sleeping child from the prohibited restraint device prior to the landing. And flight attendants ended up standing in the aisles way too long to permit them to secure the rest of the cabin prior to occupying their own jump seats for landing. This jeopardized the flight attendant's safety and that of every passenger on their aircraft. And this slide is showing typical restraint options. For infants who weigh less than 20 pounds, FAA recommends the CRS is installed aft facing, rear facing. When used in this orientation, the CRS must be installed in a forward facing seat and used in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. We recognize that NHTSA is increasing its recommendations regarding aft facing kids, so we'll be revising our recommended weights to more closely mirror NHTSA's. We also recommend that children use a forward-facing device when they weigh between 20 and 40 pounds. Best practice, however, would be to use the car seat as recommended by the manufacturer. As mentioned, there are no tether anchors on an airplane, so if the manufacturer says that the device must be secured using a top tether, it would not be permitted for use in an airplane seat. This is why we highly encourage caregivers to review their car seat manual before flight, so they know how to secure that car seat in an airplane seat. On the right is an FAA-approved device, the Child Aviation Restraint System, or CARES. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but it can be used by children between 22 and 44 pounds and who are up to 40 inches tall. CARES cannot be used in vehicles. And now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Joseph, who's going to show some videos of various device installations and discuss some of the identified challenges of CRS securement in airplane seats.
All right, thank you, Catherine. Since this is a virtual meeting, instead of something in person, I can't demonstrate in person how you would install this. We've gone to a couple of different events where we've met with caregivers, CRS manufacturers, and worked and demonstrated and collected a series of videos on installing a couple of different types of restraints in the aircraft seats. And so some of these, I'll just kind of run through them, and then we'll discuss at the end some tips and tricks and some issues that we've identified that might help you in these discussions. I think the first one is going to be, I have a couple of rear-facing ones, and I will mute my audio, and hopefully we'll see if this sounds.
Hello, I'm Christine from Peg Parago, and we are in Denver at the Lifesavers Conference, and I am with Joseph from the FAA, who has brought airplane seats. So we can test out our car seat and show you how to install it into an airplane seat. So this is our Primo Viaggio 435 Urban Mobility. It's our newest infant car seat, but this would apply to all of our infant car seats. They're all FAA approved. And sometimes the flight attendant might ask you to verify that, and it's just right here in red on the car seat, okay? So when you bring the car seat into the airplane, you're obviously carrying it. You're going to want to flip the handlebar all the way forward, because that's going to be your belt path. So I flip the handlebar forward. Thank you, Paul, for helping me there. Okay, so I'm going to take the airplane belt and buckle it. So the key The key is tightening it a little bit, but then once it starts to get tighter, you want to make sure it's through the groove and the belt path, because once you start tightening it, and you're going to want to pull this way, not up, to get a good tight fit. So you're going to pull like that. It's in there like a rock. So then you can put your and your little baby, and you're ready to go on your trip.
So you can see there's a couple of issues on, getting the restraint in there. I'll discuss a little bit on the belt compatibility. There's you might have to adjust the belt, move it around the car seat. You're going to have to almost accept what position that you'll get it in on the seat. I have another one that I installed at another event, and this is one of the ones that's an integrated stroller, and it actually does also install.
Hello, I'm Christine from Peg and we are in Denver at the Lifesavers Conference, and I am with Joseph from the FAA, who has bought fixed it in an adjustable end.
You see, they'll just basically loop right behind the belt guides on your infant carrier. They have to push down just a little bit to get the attachment, and then you can tighten it up just as you would in your automobile to get the proper fit.
Like I say, the rear facing is fairly simple. One case you had to have the bar down. In another case, the recommendation is to leave the bar up, and that's all dependent upon the uses instructions for the particular CRS. I'll go through the tips, but sometimes that belt guide, the belt gets in the way of that belt guide, so you may have to twist the buckle stock around a little bit. You notice I did have to push down some, so sometimes you have to do push in that seat to compress that seat foam. Some aircraft seats might have a lot of foam, some might be fairly stiff. It'll just kind of take a little bit of, we'll say, practice and experience on kind of pushing and integrating it in there. So next we have a forward-facing seat, and this is probably one of the larger forward-facing seats that I'll show, but then it does demonstrate really the basic process, and I'll go in and discuss some of that.
All right.
Hi, boys and girls and all the parents out there. This is Tony Jerisha, and I'm coming to you from Lifesavers Conference in Denver, Colorado. And today, we're going to show you how to take Batman on the airplane with you safely to your destination. First thing we have to do is we have to put the webbing through the belt path, which we have done, and we are going to click into the buckle, which we have done. And now Paul is going to tighten this buckle just snug. It doesn't have to be real tight, but once we've got him snug in, you're going to be pretty much good to go. We're going to put down the arms on the seat right here, so we have Batman in. Now, once you're sitting on the seat with Batman, he's going to go with you to whatever destination you are going to. And when you get there, you'll have Batman to put in the vehicle with you, so you will be safe when you're riding in that vehicle. And to all moms and dads out there, the biggest thing in the world we do is we want to keep our kids safe, whether in the airplane or whether in the vehicle.
So it looks simple when I have the aircraft seat separated from all the other seats, and we have two people to help you. But one thing here is lifting the armrest up gives you a little bit more space. Sometimes it's hard to fit that belt through that belt guide through the back of the seat. This particular seat doesn't have a hard back underneath the padding, but some seats will have a hard shell on both sides, and the belt guide goes to that. So it's a little bit difficult sometimes to feed that belt through that belt guide and get in there. I'll tell some people sometimes, well, you can loosen up that belt, as much as you need, and then feed it through and get it locked in. but obviously lifting up the armrest gives you a little bit more space. Most of the aircraft, people probably don't realize this, but a lot of the aircraft seats do have the armrest that will fold up to kind of give you that access and space in there. So it makes it a little bit easier sometimes to reach through and to feed that in there. So Catherine briefly mentioned we have a system called CARES, and it's an alternative system. And basically it's approved for aviation use only, so not for automotive use. And in this case here, we'll refer to as an aviation child safety device. The CARES right now is approved for 22 to 44 pounds, up to 40 inches tall. It's really for those who can sit in their own seats, and this will provide some of that upper torso stability and basically act as that harnessing system. The same regulation that you would follow for use on CRS would also apply for the use of the aviation child safety devices. So the installation, sometimes it's going to be dependent upon the seat and the actual seat back that it's installed on. Really, the important part is to get the installation height proper, such that you're getting that red loop, which is holding the upper torso restraint, really just about the child's shoulder height or just above the child's shoulder height, and that will provide that the upper torso restraint. It will use the aircraft lap belt. So you can kind of see there in the bottom, the aircraft lap belt will feed through those two loops and provide that attachment for the child to the seat. And I'll show, it's actually a fairly simple installation. The system itself, when you have it, you see it comes in this little, this little roll-up pouch, so they're really small and convenient to carry around. So if you have, say, maybe a child seat that's going to be at the destination or using a rental program, this would be a good option to use on board the aircraft. Before the installation, I haven't showed you any test videos. We kind of removed some of those, but sort of I'll show the video of how the CARES holds the child in the seat. This is during an aircraft seat test. And you can see it actually does restrain the child, we'll say, pretty well. We ran one of these certification tests. It met all the injury requirements. We didn't have any strap failures. The seat performance data was all expected, and this was the type of test that would need to be conducted to get approval. And some other meetings have shown some of the belly belts as well as the unrestrained child, and they pretty much happen about like you'd expect. So this here is the install.
Hi, I'm going to demonstrate how to install the CARES safety device onto an aircraft seat. So first thing you do is have your loop kind of extended out so it's wide enough so you can slip it over the seat back. So you slip it over the seat back, and on this particular seat here, there's enough space that you can actually fit it behind the tray table. So what you do is install it at the height that you need. And you can then pull the strap to kind of get the desired tightness. So pull the strap, and as I mentioned, in this case here, you can actually then close the tray table, back up so it's in use. Come over to the other side. And on the bottom, there are these two loops, and what they are the guides to route your seatbelt through. Those two guides. So you can route those through there. And once those are in, the child's ready to sit down. So have a seat. Go through the loops. Buckle your lap belt and adjust it so it's just snug, just slightly snug. Then clip your chest clips, and then you can kind of tighten up the shoulder harness. One thing you need to be careful of: you don't want to tighten the shoulder harness so much that it pulls the lap belt up. You want to keep it such that the lap belt is low and tight across the pelvis, and you can see just enough to provide that support.
So hopefully the audio came through, but a couple of items. One, you don't want to pull as tight as you can in the shoulder restraints because it'll cause that lap belt to ride up, and you don't want to have induce any submarining. It is the tray table is still fully functional, so I was able to close the tray table. The passenger behind him could still open and use the tray table as well, and it just actually provides a good alternative. So I'll speak some about the research that we've conducted in recent years. We've worked with the Center for Child Injury Prevention Studies and sponsored several research projects. One of the recent ones is we wanted to look at how were the decisions made for caregivers to fly with or without a CRS for purchasing the seat and using it, and also want to discuss with some flight attendants, what was their perceptions, what have they noticed on the aircraft in operations. So we conducted a series of surveys that went out and gathered data from the flight attendants and people who had recently traveled with children. And so we broke the results up into, we'll say, two small groups. One, we wanted to look at, why did they choose not to use a CRS and why did they choose to use a CRS? And well, the cost, as Catherine mentioned, sometimes people are price conscious. The cost was relatively high, but it was not the number one identified issue. It was really that ease of transporting the child without that CRS. Was that carrying something else through the airport, carrying it onto the airplane, getting it installed, having yet something else to hold on to. Then another one was the knowledge of travel options. Maybe not fully understanding that they can use their CRS, they can bring it with them, and that it can be installed. Interestingly enough, on the why did they use the CRS? The number two answer was ease of transporting the child. So it's kind of like the ease of transporting without was another reason for not to do it, but was also a high indicator for people who did use it. And we think that's because once people use it, they realized, well, the child's familiar with that seat, they're familiar with that environment, it's a comforting thing to them. When they're sitting in their own seat, you're not having to deal with an issue during turbulence or something else. You're not reaching down for, if you need to reach to the diaper bag or gather something else, you can easily do that. The overwhelming number one reason was safety. And they cited that, realizing, an emergency landing or during turbulence, that they knew that they could not hold that child in their arms and that even these wrap systems would not be strong enough and able to restrain the child. It was also knowledge of travel options was their third reason, understanding that, yes, they can bring their CRS and, knowing that if you get asked to point out where the label is and know what the regulations and requirements are. So really the ease in knowledge, which we take on as part of this whole information communications campaign to start discussing with people like you who might go meet with new caregivers and discuss with them, if they're going to be flying soon, to kind of keep this in mind. This particular research project, I guess you will get a copy of the slides. This one was recorded, and so you can go to the YouTube link and get a lot more detail and actually some of the statements, some of the narrative statements that were collected. The another study that we looked at, and so the 213 requirements and getting the approval just means it goes through some sort of testing. And that's really adding that rollover test to ensure that the restraint system can hold the child in terms of an inversion. But that really doesn't do anything in terms of, is that seat actually going to fit on the aircraft? So we sponsored another study, which was to gather the physical geometrical dimensions of a variety of child restraint systems, and then compare that with the physical geometry of various different aircraft seats, and kind of do this comparison and say, do the child seats even fit on that aircraft into that seat, let alone be able to install it and use it, and with the long-term goal of hoping to develop some sort of guidelines that either caregivers or airlines could use to kind of start showing what would be or would not be compatible. Obviously, some of the issues is really how much space do you have, between your seat back and the seat in front of you. That our seats tend to have a lot less space in them than what you'd have in an automobile. Our seat cushions tend to be a little bit shorter. So some of these seats that have a wide base or a wide part that you want to get on there may turn to kind of overhang the seat back a little bit. That means the seat cushion a little bit, which would probably not be ideal. The width between the armrests, and that we have, since we have armrests there, we have a defined width, and that can vary between aircraft. In an automotive environment, generally you don't have to deal with that. It's unless you're trying to put maybe 3 car seats in a row in a back seat, but usually if you're doing 2, there's going to be enough width. And the seat pan angle, our seat bottoms tend to be a little bit more horizontal than what you would have in an automobile. So again, that maybe gives some challenges for installing, say, a rear-facing seat where you're trying to line up to get it at the correct level that you need. One thing to note is that if you have an approved CRS that's approved for use on aircraft, and you purchased a ticket for that additional seat, and for some reason it does not fit in the seat that you reserved or ticketed, the airline is responsible for accommodating you in that same class of service and another part of the aircraft where that seat can be installed. Now they may have some additional requirements on what are the safe seat locations for that specific aircraft and where they're allowing them installed. So it will be, within the confines of what they allow. So as I'm mentioning, this fit, and we used to talk about, well, why is this fit important? How does it fit in there? These are some, we'll say, some old videos, and really the belt should be tight. Some older aircraft seats where the seat belt was actually attached to the seat was maybe a little bit more forward, and we'll see how that really affects the performance. So you can see that forward anchor location really doesn't do a good job of holding that seat in there, and allows that seat really to translate and pivot forward quite significantly. A lot of newer designs have been recommended to kind of move the anchor point in a more aft position, which kind of pulls back with a lot more tension and kind of holding that seat better, well coupled there. So these were some older ones, and you can kind of see this in some newer designs as well. Again, it should be tightened in there. This is a seat test that was conducted in Australia, where you can see there's a forward facing, and then on the far side you can see there's actually an aft facing seat in there as well. In this case here, we've got the double row to kind of show how you will get some of that interaction going on with the seat in front of you. You'll notice that in the test, the seat forward tends to start to break over. Most aircraft seats are designed to break over like that naturally in the event of a crash, so that way it kind of pulls that seat back away from the occupant from kind of getting that interaction. So from reviewing the research and conducting some of these install fits, we'll say some tips and tricks. These are just some things to note, and these will be available. So if your seat seems to be too wide to fit in the seat, as we did that forward facing one, you can lift the armrest up and out of the way to get that extra little bit of clearance to kind of get it put in there where you're pushing it back, and give your hands a little bit more space to kind of feed that buckle through the belt path. So maybe you can't get the buckle on the rear facing seat through the belt guides. You see I had to kind of push down on it some. Sometimes that buckle will line up right in the middle of where that buckle guide is, and then you can't get it buckle at all. It is okay, just as you would an automotive, to twist that buckle stock until you can feed the webbing portion through. I know automotive you up to 3 times. And these, depending upon the particular seat, 3 times is acceptable. Maybe you have to go 4. It's really to ensure whatever you have to do to kind of get that good fit. As I mentioned, sometimes maybe you can't get the rear-facing seat aligned properly. And that's due to the difference between an airplane and automotive seats that may make this difficult to kind of line up that level line indicator for the age of the child. it's okay if you can't quite match it up exactly. Realizing that you may have to accept a non-standard installation. You can use something, use a towel or anything you can to put under there. So maybe that car seat manufacturer would disallow the use of something in there typically. But in this case here, we're saying, yes, it's okay to do what you can to have to position it because we have these seating differences. For a forward-facing seat, if you don't have a hard shell between the seat back and the padding, that buckle sometimes ends up right in the middle of the back of where the child's sitting. And the last thing you want, a child is not going to be very comfortable sitting on that buckle, for a couple of hours because it's going to poke them in the back. It is okay to place a towel or other light padding then between that seat back and their back. I know you're generally not supposed to add anything there, but it's something to kind of promote that use, and it's going to be acceptable. Our buckles, we know we don't use the push to release buckles. We have lift latch. So when that buckle is in that forward-facing seat is behind there, you want to twist the buckle such that the opening mechanism is facing the seat back. The reason is because if it's facing the CRS or the child, it might be hard to get in there to unbuckle that seat belt because you want that buckle latch to kind of go away from there. I'll show you what one of the buckles looks like here. So like I said, so we have these lift latch, and you can see there as you pull it, the left latch is out. The latch lifts out, and you want that lift out to go towards the aircraft seat. That way you have space for it to open. Because if it's going towards the CRS or the child seat back, or it's one of the hardbacks, you're not going to be able to open it up. It'll just bind up on that seat back, and it'll be quite difficult. So you may have to again twist that seat belt when you route it through in order to kind of get it locked up and lined up in there. Let's see here. And then I guess I will play one other video. So you'll get this. So this is just one that's kind of a quick tips for parents. When you go to our website, there will be lots of other videos that will go through, traveling with children, things, their first flight, what to look out for, how to prepare going through the airport. There'll be other install videos for both forward and aft facing seats as well as cares.
Parents, flying with family can be fun and challenging. We get it. While flying is super safe, we have some tips for you when you make your plans to travel with a child under 2. The safest place for your infant or child is in an approved child restraint system or device, not on your lap. Your arms can't hold your infant or child securely, especially during unexpected turbulence. Here are some tips for flying with a child under 2. Consider purchasing a ticket for your child to reserve a seat and use a child restraint or device. When booking, see if your airline has a place for you to note that you will be traveling with an approved child restraint or device. Check that the child restraint or device is approved for use on aircraft and has proper labels or markings. Use a rear or forward-facing safety restraint that matches your child's height and weight. If you choose to travel with a child on your lap, know that booster, harness type, or lap-held restraints can never be used during takeoff, landing, and movement on the surface. The FAA has approved one best type device called CARES. Check with your airline for their specific child and family travel policies. Use a child safety seat or device for every flight. It's the smart and right thing to do, so everyone in your family arrives safely at your destination. Okay, now I'm
sure everyone's got that music, you know, burned into their brains, and they're going to be hearing that all afternoon. But so you can go to our website for flying with children, and so be able to find a lot more tips and information as well as some videos. And if you have any questions that ever come up on using the child seats or flying with children, we have a generic email that's crs@faa.gov. And I think with that, that is our last slide. And so we would be happy to take some questions now.
I got a whole list.
Yeah, did you want me to just read through them, or did you want to?
I got some written. I made some comments.
Okay.
Some of them.
Let Catherine answer some too.
So I think some of it, and I can if you want to let me share, I'll share. I got a couple of slides to finish out too. When you get a second, Joseph, too, you can unshare. But I think it's important to understand. There's definitely some different dynamics when we're talking aircraft versus vehicles, and ultimately, the same reason as adults. The big reason I believe, Catherine, you can probably clarify or add in, but we're using those restraints in the event of turbulence primarily. That's the goal, to keep us from flying about a cabin. So understanding that, I think, is important. Some of there was quite a few questions in regards to flight attendants on the aircraft. Are they trained to look for the FAA sticker, or is there awareness on their end? A lot of people have expressed difficulty oftentimes with flight attendants, and maybe Catherine, you can share some experiences or some strategies when preparing to fly with kids.
Yeah, I know that's always a great question, and it does come up. So are flight attendants responsible? Air carriers actually must validate that label is on that device, and then they certainly would ask their flight attendants to do so. The assumption is that flight attendants are doing that with every car seat that comes on board, but we know that in their duties during boarding, that doesn't always happen. But our suggestion is that caregivers are prepared to show that label, that they've looked to see how that device is installed in that airplane seat, and therefore they can have that conversation with, here's the label and here's how it's installed. I'm going to throw a link in the chat, or I guess in the Q&A, Scott, if you will, that's a guidance device that talks from the FAA that talks about some requirements for flight attendants, some requirements for passengers, and some of the information that would help the caregivers on the airplane just feel a little bit more confident about when they go to an airport and they're going to use that child restraint device, what they need to know in order to do so. I think one of the things is to remain kind and calm and talk and ask the flight attendant, what questions do you have, and what is your reason for asking me to show or prove or to disallow me to use this device? And I think just an understanding. But I think the onus is on the parent to understand how that device works, because if you think about the 100,000 flight attendants that are out there, they don't know all the devices, and many of them, this is the first time they've seen that specific car seat, so they might be confused by it and not understand it.
Yeah, for sure. And like you said, there's every airline, I'm sure, has its own specific guidance and rules and regs, and for their employees that are flying. So a lot of variables between airlines when you're traveling as well.
That's correct. And we would recommend that before flying, that every caregiver would reach out to their air carrier, find the type of aircraft on which they're going to fly, specifically what seat, and they can kind of figure out what type of seat is on board, where the location is, and find out what those policies are.
Awesome. Joseph talked quite a bit about, and there were a number of questions that maybe we can kind of combine them in there a little bit, but using that lap belt on the airplane with the flip, the paddle type latch plate, they're concerned with, it's running into the belt guide or maybe some incompatibilities where we need to twist the belt to get it so that the seat fits in there appropriately. Sarah asked, like in a vehicle, are we allowed a certain number of twists to get that buckle latch mechanism moved to a correct location? Or if it's digging into my kid's back, can I twist it to maybe move that over to the side where there's some more room to create more comfort when we're, you know, on a several hour flight?
Yeah, I know in automotive, you have what the limit of what, three twists or something. We haven't gone through and said, yes, it's only one or two or three. What you'll find sometimes on that fixed end, three might be the most you can actually physically twist it. But you know, maybe you have a really long belt or something else, you might need to do more. It's really what you need to, for us, it's really what you need to do to install it, because we don't have another, there's not like another installation option. So it's not like we can say is, okay, you can't get the belt to get in there, you got to get another seat, or you got to use your latch now or something. So we don't specifically limit that.
Excellent. One of the options that I hear a lot about, and I'm not overly familiar because my kids are older, you know, I don't travel with little ones, hopefully grandkids before too long, you know, is the CARES. So is that device, you know, do I have to purchase it? Are they provided by the airlines if I request it when I, you know, through ticketing? How popular are there? Has there been research done? And then maybe how do we address incompatibilities with those? You know, am I going to make the passenger behind me mad because I'm tying up their tray table or those kind of things?
So they're actually really easy to buy. AmSafe is the manufacturer, and they make about 90% of all seatbelts on aircraft. So you can go to the AmSafe website. We would never recommend buying it outside of the manufacturer because there's a lot of knockoffs out there, but it's really easy to carry. It's about $80, $85, I believe. To your point or your question, Scott, about how many people are using it, unfortunately, we have no idea, just because it's someone occupying a seat, right? So it would be under there. You know, the only challenge is that it can't be used in vehicles. So oftentimes people use it on an airplane when they have you know, an alternate device to use in a vehicle when they get to their destination.
Yeah, it's actually kidsflysafe.com is their website. Now, yeah, be careful. People will go on Amazon and you'll find things that are similar. And there's a lot of, we'll say, you know, counterfeit items on Amazon that haven't been attested where buckles or things might break. Just for visual reference, you know, this is the entire CARES device. I mean, you can fold it up even smaller. So it's really small to just kind of carry with you. And I know the second part of your question was, you know, what about if you have to block the tray table, what happens there? Maybe, you know, you just got to rely on you know, maybe a little bit of kindness ahead of time helps maybe ease the tension a little bit. Maybe you got to speak with the person that's going to be seated back there and just let them know, hey, I'm using this. Sorry for your trouble. You can offer to, you know, not they're promoting, offer to buy them a snack maybe or something, or just say, hey, you know. And then you can also say, well, my kid will be much quieter using this than say, well, if not in it, they can be fidgeting around and bouncing the seat and screaming the whole flight. So it's really trying to kind of, you know, use that negotiating skill and work out, you know, some sort of, you know, agreement in advance if you have to actually block the tray table.
But I would offer that if you look at the video that Joseph shared, if it doesn't interfere with that tray table on many designs. So it can be used, the tray table can be stowed and released fine. And so it shouldn't interfere.
More getting it in there and really seeing how it fits in, and probably, you know, if I'm on a Boeing versus an Airbus versus whatever, probably some differences in those configurations. Joseph, you also talked about, when you were talking about the installation, the Batman seat comes to mind, but moving the armrests out of the way to be able to get that seat installed. Then are you able to get those armrests down? Somebody asked, you know, one of the requirements on takeoff and landing is that, you know, your tray tables are stowed and your armrests are down and the seat backs are upright. What if we can't get that armrest back down?
Yes. So I was saying, when you move the armrests up, it's moving them up just to ease the installation, just to provide you the extra little bit of access to kind of fit your arm back there, get your hand in to grab the buckle, but you should be able to lower those armrests back down afterwards. Because otherwise, if you can't get those armrests back down, then that seat is probably too wide. And then it's probably, then that base would be much wider than that actual seat location. Generally, we say to put the CRS, towards the window, not in the aisle, it's in that window seat. And some aviation seats may or may not have a window armrest, or there might be a little bit additional space that you can have in that window seat. And sometimes the middle seat ends up being a little bit wider. So it's generally, you should almost always be able to put the armrest back down.
Perfect. Great. There's a lot of question too, within the industry, and when we talk good, better, best, trying to apply the best principle and keeping kids rear facing longer. So, we're encouraging parents to keep their children rear facing longer in vehicles. What's the FFA stance? And what if we got kids that, we're keeping in a rear facing seat, upwards 3+ years? How should I address that on aircraft?
I would recommend that you use the car seat as it's intended and as the manufacturer says to do so. So a 3-year-old is absolutely allowed to use a rear-facing car seat. It might be difficult. I mean, we all know that the legs are going to be bent, and that's going to be fine. It might be difficult because it might interfere with the seat in front. And so Joseph shared that it's up to the air carrier to provide some accommodation for that if it doesn't fit. But certainly use the car seat as intended.
And I think that kind of goes back to, the most of us in attendance right now are probably technicians or instructors. And, that's some of that guidance that we can help those families with when they come ask you. So this is a good thing to refer back to and to help explain or give guidance to those parents or caregivers. I know, Catherine, we've done this similar presentation before, and some of my questions, it's pretty easy to understand if I'm flying from Denver to St. Louis, what to expect when I get to St. Louis. But what if I catch a flight from LAX and I'm going to Heathrow or, somewhere in Europe? What should I expect when I get there, and how might I plan, or what are some resources I can look up going into an international flight?
So everything that we're talking about right now applies to U.S. certificated operators. So if you're flying on British Airways, our rules do not apply. So again, we would recommend you contacting the air carrier, making sure you're aware of what's allowed, what they accept. And I don't know enough about when I travel in Europe, but I certainly would do some investigation, because I do know that car seats are different there and there are different standards. And so your car seat that's accepted in the United States may or may not be accepted for use on a non-US certificated carrier, as well as in a vehicle once you get there.
So maybe doing a little bit more research as to your destination and what countries you're going to be in, and maybe planning ahead a little bit more.
Correct.
With
Yeah.
there were
and same thing, coming this way, maybe coming from Europe, starting next year, there will be some car seats that are latch only. There might be no belt guides. In the sense, you can't use a latch car seat on an aircraft. You don't want someone to board it with a latch system, and there's no way to install it at all. So again, it's, be aware of what seat you have and what airline you're flying.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. There were a number of questions in regards to adults and children. So if I got 3 kids and I'm just me, can I have 3 kids in a car seat as me being the only adult? And I know some of that's got to do with safety and the adult being able to evacuate the child. So can you touch on that a little bit, Catherine?
Sure. So we don't limit that. I mean, that's not anything that we would address. The regulation, as we talked about earlier, is that there must be an adult to provide assistance to that child that's in the car seat. So I saw that someone asked, what's the age? Well, certainly that is required by the air carrier. Some as low as 12, you're considered an adult. And so is that appropriate? I don't know. But we would require at least one adult, and in our opinion, that's an 18-year-old, to care for that child. Air carriers are allowed to set policy, and I know some are more strict than others. Again, before you get on that airplane, be sure that you're checking with the air carrier to make sure what that policy is.
And then we're going to go ahead and finish our last few slides, but Joseph and Catherine, if you're able to stay on for a few minutes, we can try to get through these last questions. And if not, I can
Yes.
send them in an email. We can follow up that way.
Yeah, and the last slide of the presentation had your contact information, and I'm sure you'd be happy to solicit more questions. There's a ton of questions, which is awesome. So before you go, just a few closing announcements. I hope you guys enjoy the series. We sure enjoy them as a board, and the presenters that are bringing this information to you. We hope you'll join us tomorrow for we have a webinar certification training update for technicians. And in December, we have a CEU webinar on CPS hot topics coming up. So those are some that are coming up. Use that QR code to help get you to where you need to go to register. And again, a big thank you to our presenters, Joseph and Catherine, for bringing this to us. This webinar, it will be posted at carseateducation.org within the next couple business days. For the child passenger safety technicians, the presentation qualifies for 1 CEU, and proof of attendance will be emailed within 24 hours. Be sure that you need to go in and enter that information into your Safe Kids profile at cert.safekids.org to receive that CEU for your recertification. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. Have a safe day, and thank you all for the work that you do, helping us keep child passengers and their families safe in vehicles and in aircraft.
All right. Are you guys available for the last few questions, or would you like me to send them in an email? Joseph, you're on mute.
Yeah, I can stay for a little bit, but there were a lot of questions, and so I'm wondering how we want to address.
There's a lot
those.
of questions. A lot can be lumped together, though.
Okay. And then will you follow up if we don't get to everything, or people want some more information that we can provide? I know that there's a question like about the Apogee study, and so I can absolutely share a link with that later.
Yes. One person asked if they heard correctly, if all flight attendants are trained. They use challenge caregivers on using a car seat to show the label.
Just that they're aware of the label and their responsibility to check it. Yes.
Okay. And then we answered
that they would not know where that label is on every single car seat.
Okay. A lot of technicians don't either.
That's hard.
It is. Do you have any statistics on the usage of the FAA recommended CARES device on flights over the past several years?
We don't, unfortunately. That'd be great to know.
And then one person wrote, I was confused about the status of the Ride Safer travel vest. The slide showed a label saying the Ride Safer strap could be used secure on an airplane, kind of like a CARES, but it was pretty clear that the FAA said it cannot be used. Can it be used?
It cannot be used. I know they're working on a tether, but because we don't allow tethers and there's an additional weight that's added to the back of that aircraft, it cannot be used in airplanes right now.
Okay. A lot of these you answered. There's some like international questions that we answered.
Oops.
We answered the rear facing. What about inflatable seatbelts?
So inflatable seatbelts generally cannot be used with CRSs. One, they will not fit the belts are a bit thicker, so they don't fit through. And I think on all of the most of them, they say not permitted for use with CRSs.
So if that can be deactivated, I know some air carriers will allow you to use a seatbelt extension, which deactivates that airbag, and then it can be used. I mean, is that the best place? No, but if that's the only place that CRS can be used, it's acceptable if the airbag is deactivated.
But not all, and some of them not all of them can be deactivated with a belt extender. So it's not just putting extender. It used to be the extender deactivated the airbag, but there are some now that they're always active even if the extender is on there.
Right. So the flight attendants would know that, and they would have procedures to allow or to not allow that.
Yeah. And I was talking when I was muted, but the Ride Safer vest, the labeling doesn't say it's approved. It says it's approved with the attachment strap, but the attachment strap is basically a top tether. And since we have no way to attach the top tether to the aircraft seat, it's not approved for use on the aircraft. So it's because it does not meet the 213 requirements in doing the rollover test without that top tether. So again, it's following the instructions, and we have to follow the instruction of installation. It can't be used.
And then one other question, and I'm going to read it how I'm interpreting it, because I think, and Kayla, if you're still on, you can correct me. Can parents be required to forward face a child who still meets the minimum requirements of a car seat if the flight attendant is assisting due to the video screens on the back of the seat? I'm wondering if like the seat's hitting the screen and they're making them forward face.
I mean, with any car seat, we require that seat to be used in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. So if it can be secured aft facing and it, that child meets that, the assumption is that it will be used aft facing, rear facing. The interference with the video screen is irrelevant. Safety is paramount to comfort. And so, the person in front can't recline, but yet that rear facing is the safety impact for that child user. So we would say, one, that passenger in front doesn't get to recline. And two, if that passenger wants to recline, he should be reaccommodated. The car seat should not be reaccommodated. And I guess the last thing would just be make sure that, if it's a rear facing only, we would never allow that seat to be used in forward facing. So, that kind of takes that option off the table. Does that answer that?
I think so.
Okay.
I think they were worried about the car seat touching the screen and potentially causing damage to it.
And I think, Kendra, that kind of falls, there was another one that kind of talked about maybe an airline having a policy and setting a parameter that they said Delta says on their site that children over 40 inches must sit in the forward facing position in their child restraint. So if there's a conflict between airline regulation or airline policy and car seat manufacturer recommendations, would we default to car seat manufacturer if there's a disagreement?
I would say yes. However, everything we've talked about is check with your air carrier. And if Delta, and I've not heard that, Scott, I'll go back and take a look, but if Delta is more restrictive, they are allowed to be more restrictive. And I don't know why they would be, but we can certainly talk about that more with them.
And I think a lot of this just, not everyone has sat through a 3 or 4 day car seat certification training, right? So there's a lot of information that we have that others don't. Ultimately, I think the job of all of us is to make sure everybody's safe, flight attendants included. And sometimes we just need to communicate better and have a little bit of a conversation as how can we meet everyone's needs to ensure safety for everyone that's on the aircraft or in the vehicle.
I hear a couple questions. I mean, if you go to our website, we say 0 to 20 should be rear facing, 20 to 40 should be forward facing. And I recognize that those are very binary. And as we all know, car seats are beyond those limits. So, I think in that situation, the car seat is the precedent setting, right? If it's allowed to be used beyond 40, then certainly let's keep them rear facing. Like I said, I'm curious about Delta and I'll reach out to that. And maybe Delta is just parroting, here's the recommendation, but it certainly is not a requirement from the FAA.
And then I'll end it with this last question. And then the other few, they're mostly about the study. And so I'll just email you directly. And then Christina, if you're still on, I'll copy you on it. Does the FAA have a social media collateral or media kit for agencies to use on their social channels?
Not of which I'm aware, but we certainly can get materials to people. And so if they want to reach out to that CRS at faa.gov email, and I can make that connection and do whatever they need and get them the sources they need.
And it looked like a lot of your videos were linked through YouTube. So I'm assuming the FAA has a YouTube channel and they can access the videos that way too.
That's correct.
Okay.
Right. And I think some of those links are on the Fly Safe with Kids website from the FAA.
Perfect. So yeah, I will email you both the last few questions that we just didn't get to. But thank you for staying on a little bit longer. I'll go ahead and stop the recording. And thank you for like half the people